we are going to discuss this very important movie with our experts. This discussion will be followed by a Q&A session. You can pose your questions in the chat of the website. With us, we have Stoffel Debuysere, curator of cinema and audiovisual arts, researcher dealing with the political dimensions of the cinema, who introduced the film, and Christophe Busch. Christophe Busch studied criminology and Holocaust and genocide studies. He worked for 12 years in the field of psychiatry, focusing on perpetrator treatment. He is an expert in polarization dynamics and radicalization processes. Until the end of 2019, he was General Director of Caserne d'Ossau, the Belgian Holocaust and Human Rights Memorial, Museum and Research Center. Now he leads the Hannah Arendt Institute for Diversity, Urbanity, and Citizenship. He curated, together with Hans Citroën and Robert Jan van Pelt, the exhibition Auschwitz Camp in the years 2019-2020. So, Christophe, we have seen a very realistic and I would say crude image of Auschwitz-Birkenau. How correct is this film from the historical point of view?
Thank you, Joanna, for this question. It's of course a very gruesome image we see in this film that is specifically focusing on the end stage of the genocide. And what we can state is that this film is historically well informed, written, and a lot of historical details that are known today are in this film and entwined, of course, with the narrative they want to bring. I want to highlight some of the elements we have seen in the film. Firstly, you actually see, of course, the daily life of the Sonderkommandos, which are, of course, the commandos, prisoner details who are forced to work in the crematoria buildings at the end of Birkenau, the very large concentration camp that has at the end of its facility 4 large crematoria and gas chambers. And this Sonderkommando group has, of course, the task to cremate the bodies, to gas the people, the many thousand people, more than 900,000 people who are deported to Auschwitz, who get murdered in the gas chambers. We have a lot of sources that actually bring us the details of the daily life of the Sonderkommando. We, of course, have testimonies of former members of the Sonderkommandos. You also saw this doctor pathologist Niesli, who survived the Holocaust and also has testimony written down on his work, what he did and what he saw in this very specific place in Birkenau. And very uniquely, we also have written sources by the Sonderkommando members themselves, who were written down during their work in Birkenau and were hidden in the ground near the crematoria buildings. So this is what's sometimes called documents which come from the heart of the hell. And members like Zalman Gradowski were those people who wrote down their experiences for giving testimony of what they were obliged to do in this specific commando. And after the war, of course, there were a lot of narratives who explained that these documents, these Auschwitz scrolls, were hid around the crematoria, and some of the scrolls were founded and then were later on also published. Important to state is that for a very long time, the story of the Sonderkommando was actually taboo. A lot of members had feelings of guilt, and of course it's what Hannah Arendt called the ultimate crime, where of course you oblige victims to become a part of the process of the killing machinery. And of course it took many decades that these former Sonderkommandos started giving testimony, and actually resulting now in a much larger understanding. And we have not only the written sources, but also like former Sonderkommando members like David Oller, who made a lot of drawings of the killing facility at Birkenau. So this is one major aspect you can see in the film, the daily life of the Sonderkommandos. And of course, you see it on a specific moment in history. And what you actually see is the largest wave of extermination in Auschwitz is what we call Aktion Höss. And that was actually more than 437,000 Hungarian Jews who are at the end of the war, just between May and the beginning of July 1944, were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau to be killed. And from these more than 430,000 Hungarian Jews, 320,000 were killed upon arrival. And that was actually the largest wave of killing in Birkenau in only eight weeks of time. This is actually what we also visually can see in the very renowned Auschwitz album, what we call the Lili Jacob album. The person who discovered the album during the liberation phase. And this is actually the album that was used also in the Auschwitz trial, that is now to be seen in a lot of Holocaust museums and memorials, which actually is a sort of combination of a lot of photos that the Erkennungsdienst, the photographical department, took of a lot of situations in the camp, but also specifically how the killing process was shaped. And the reason for making this album was actually to have a sort of visual portrayal of how this murderous process could be shown to higher ranking officers and etc. Around 15 of these albums are probably made. Former prisoner photographers reported that many of these albums were made, and of course this one specific album survived the war and gives us this image. And you actually see in these photos, a lot of people of course have already seen these photos, and you actually see the people arriving at what we call the Neue Rampe, the new railway in Birkenau leading towards the gas chambers, and then the many thousands of people who are of course directed or to the gas chambers or to the sauna to become a forced laborer in the camp system. So this is a very specific phase in the history of Auschwitz that is portrayed here. You see that this Sonderkommando, the 12th Sonderkommando, is working during these Aktion Höss. And what you also can see, and that's actually what I think the movie is about from a historical perspective, is of course the acts of resistance you can see. And there are actually two large ways of resisting against this extermination process that we can see. One first way you can resist is, of course, to warn the world what is happening in this place. So this is actually done by writing down what is happening and trying through Polish resistance groups, bring out the words so that the other countries are informed of what is happening at that time, but also by taking photos. And we can explain a little bit later what this photography from the Sonderkommando delivered us. Another way of resistance, of course, is destructing the killing facilities. And there are two means, hoping that there would be Allied bombing on the killing facility, or that you do it by your own means, and by destructing the crematoria, by bringing in gunpowder, large amount of gunpowder that was brought in through to the internal resistance by the female labor commando that was working in the ammunition factories, and they brought little bits of gunpowder into the camp, into the crematoria surroundings, and there it was finally used. In this 7th October of 44, the very renowned revolt we had in Auschwitz, where at Crematorium 4, there was actually a revolt that was initiated there. There was a lot of tension because within the camp, they found it too soon to already have an uprising. They wanted to wait for the Allied soldiers, for the Russian soldiers, of course, to come nearer to the camp, to have a sort of possibility of surviving after the revolt. But what is important is that this Sonderkommando knew that their last days were counted, because a Sonderkommando is, after some months, killed because they are what they call in German Geheimnisträger. They, of course, are the best informed witnesses you can have of what is happening in Auschwitz. And to prevent leaking out their narratives, each time after some months, a Sonderkommando was killed. And this Sonderkommando, the 12th Sonderkommando, knew that their time was coming, that they would be killed. And of course, they had this, pressing issue that if they wanted to revolt, they needed to do it these days, the 7th of October. And this is actually what you see at the end of the movie. An important aspect that you also see is taking photos of the extermination process by the Sonderkommando. And you see how Saul is there also with his bucket with a smuggled photo camera, taking photos from inside the Crematorium 5 building of what's happening outside. And this is actually also true narrative, true sources which this film is based on. So from my point of view, it's not only artistically a very intriguing representation of a very specific element in the Holocaust, but it's really also well historically documented. The smallest remark that I can make is that, of course, in this time frame, you see all these events portrayed after each other. And of course, there is a little bit more time gap between all these specific events you can see in the movie, but what they bring is historically correct.
Thank you very much, Christophe. It is important, the question of sources, and you touched upon one of the elements which is also crucial for our permanent exhibition at the House of European History, where we present those accounts which you mentioned, namely the copy of an account by Leib Langfuss. And also we show those photos which are very taken from hiding. They are not very visible, what is visible there, but even the atmosphere, you can see that it's an account of something really atrocious. So also a quotation that we provide, I would like to quickly quote because it's so important. Dear finder, search everywhere in every inch of the soul, so that the world would find material traces of millions of murdered people. And you told us about the historical way of finding the truth. Now there is this also this matter of how to inform public, how to talk to people who are not specialists in the field about what happened in the crematoriums of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And the film shows a very brutal image, which is obvious because it shows the reality. But violence, putting violence on display is always a matter for discussion and something that is really debated. Also because of sensitivity of that matter and sensitivity of the viewers. So in your opinion, how does public should be informed about the Holocaust today when eyewitnesses are dying or they are mostly dead?
Thank you. Indeed, it's of course very important to see the evolutions in the way we represent the Holocaust. And of course, a lot of eyewitnesses are deceased and are unable to give their testimony. So the sources we have and the analysis, the many books and research that is done on the Holocaust becomes more important. And of course, we see some problems in that light. One of the major problems, I think, that is that we actually have a huge amount of documents. We have kilometers of archival material. We have estimated to 3 million photos related to the Holocaust. And what we actually see, of course, is that there is a very limited use of this material. So, of course, when you look now at the literature, you see that it starts with a lot of ego documents, witnesses, survivors who wrote down their own story and gave a representation of what they personally experienced. And then, of course, you have the more analytical approach. You have like Hannah Arendt, who wrote on totalitarianism, and then later on the Eichmann trial. You have Raoul Hilberg. You have a lot of top experts really going into depth, researching all these archival materials, and gives us a better understanding of the very complex interplay of actors and factors that led up to this Holocaust. And the problem is a little bit in this representation to the public. If you do it now through a movie, a documentary, like the very renowned Shoah documentary by Claude Lanzmann, or like the Holocaust series, the American Holocaust series, with more fictionally representation of the Holocaust. And what you actually see is that they're based on a very limited set of sources. So it's what we call the icons of destruction, and the classical imagery that we have seen after the liberation of the camps. And you have classically this image of the Jewish boy in the Warsaw ghetto who is raising his hands with the SS man with his rifle on the back, of course. And then you see this image, or the image of the British soldier on this bulldozer pushing all the bodies in Bergen-Belsen in mass graves, or the classical photo of Auschwitz-Birkenau, where you see this tin pans at the entrance. These are very classical representations of victims in the barracks and etc. And the problem is, in my point of view, that we need to use much more sources who go into depth and show the dynamics. And actually, a lot of stories we have discovered and aren't represented today. And like what we have seen now in this movie, and the four photos taken by the Sonderkommando are a very good example, because there is a lot of discussion. Can you use this material? Can't you use it? What do you see? How was this image? How was it used? How was it cropped? What does it shows? What doesn't it show, this image, and etc. And so from my point of view, important discussions, what we always see in this representation of the Holocaust is you have this binary approach of people who say you can't show what actually was evolving at that time. It's obscene to show what you can't show what's happening inside the gas chamber. You can't represent that. And then you have another group who actually states, no, we need to show. And of course, it means that we need to show this atrocity imagery, which is a very important element, of course, within the Holocaust. The other group says, no, you can't understand. It's beyond our imagination what has happened. And another group said, we need to understand the mechanisms that lie beneath these processes. And the first group would say you can't compare. It's a sacred aspect, and there is some sort of sacrality around this form of extreme violence that genocide is. And another group says, no, we need to have a comparative methodology to see what we can learn from one specific case to take lessons for other cases. And a lot of discussions between the uniqueness of the Holocaust or the comparability of the Holocaust is actually between these two more extreme groups. And I think what's interesting is that this movie, when you see like people like Claude Lanzmann, who states it's obscene to show even historical documents in documentary, which he doesn't use in his documentary Shoah. And you have other people like Didi Huberman, who really state you need to focus on what the sources brings us, what they tell us. Both these extreme positions really have a very positive appreciation of this movie. So I think this opens up the discussion what this movie is actually doing also within the representational debate on how we can bring the Holocaust towards a wider public.
Thank you. And not mentioning even the fact that the vast majority of the images we have now were taken by perpetrators. So this is another issue worth adding. Now maybe I would like to ask Stoffel about more cinematographical aspects of the film. As mentioned by Christophe, Lanzmann gave a very high praise to the film. And he said that it is not at all melodramatic. It's done with a very great modesty. I think we cannot agree more. Could you add something to that and comment on the cinematographic representations of the Holocaust as such?
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, what I could say is that this film not only incorporates a lot of historical references, and indeed László Nemes did an immense research before making the film, before producing the film. But the film also incorporates, I think, a lot of the debates that are still going on around the representation of the Holocaust, in particular by way of images. And I think he does it by way of his mise en scène, but he also does it by way of his use of sound. And well, if we go back to the broader discussion on the representation or the representability of the Holocaust, of course, it has to do with what you mentioned, a broader global ethical concern about the representation of violence and suffering, and the whole question whether it's acceptable and under which conditions it's acceptable to turn facts or situations of suffering and violence into images. But there's also a specific concern related to the Holocaust, and I think these debates started up especially around the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 80s, and revolved around, for example, this series that Christophe also mentioned, a Holocaust, a series made by Marvin Chomsky in 1978. And later, of course, there were huge debates around Schindler's List by Steven Spielberg or La Vita è Bella by Roberto Benigni in the 90s. And of course, these films were oftentimes criticized or accused because of their sugarcoating effects, because of their effects of consolation and commiseration. And I think, for one, Nemes has also mentioned that he has often been frustrated by a lot of the fictions that have been produced on the Holocaust. And he has been frustrated by the way that a lot of these films aim to rationalize the Holocaust by way of typical plots driven by cause and effects logic, by logic of identification and so forth. So as opposed to that, he crafted this aesthetics, which is quite particular, an aesthetic which is based in notions and experiences of immediacy, immersivity. He also consciously restricted the perspective by using a very particular lens, a 25mm film lens. And of course, he also worked with out of focus effects and with these blurring effects, for example, in order to make the legibility of the image difficult, to frustrate, in a way, the voyeurism of the spectator. Now, in regards to this use of sounds, because the sound design is quite elaborate and quite important in the film, One of the arguments that always comes up, in particular from Claude Lanzmann and the people around Lanzmann, is that no image can be adequate to the horror of the extermination, because the image always trivializes. It always trivializes the extreme, and in particular the unicity or the unicity of the Holocaust, because he considers indeed the Holocaust as something unique, as something incomparable. And as the Holocaust is unique and the image is a double, the image will always be a lie, will always be deceptive, will always be a manipulation. It can only soften the horror, take its edge off, it can only trivialize. For him, horror can only be told by way of the spoken word. And so the whole argument to in a way accentuate the unicity of his own film, of Shoah, is really to oppose the visual image with the spoken word. Now, what is indeed very special is that Lanzmann has taken up the defense of Son of Saul, which is the first time that he has spoken positively about a fiction film dedicated to the Holocaust. And he has indeed says that Son of Saul is not about representation, which is a strange argument to make. And he even says that Son of Saul has not set out to represent the gas chambers. But of course, his focus is really on the image, and he sees the image as a duplicate. He sees the image as a kind of representation associated with notions of sufficiency and legibility. But the questions, of course, doesn't sound also represent? How is a representation by way of sound different than representation by way of images? Because of course you can hear what is going on in the gas chambers in the beginning of this film of Son of Saul. So in a way, there's a kind of strange argument that is made, which involves sound and the double role of sound. In Lanzmann's films, sounds as spoken words, and in the film of Nemes, sound as something that is chaotic, and that doesn't lend itself to an unambiguous legibility. So in many ways, unwillingly or not, the film contributes a lot to the debates, the ongoing debates on the representation of the Holocaust in cinema. Yeah.
Thank you. I am actually receiving now questions from the viewers, and Juan is asking about a specific format, about the ratio of this movie. Would you maybe elaborate more on the format and technical aspects of the film which help the director to convey the message he wants to convey?
Well, first of all, he has chosen for film, so not for the digital format, because he wanted to avoid that the image would be too clean, let's say. So the whole production of the film involves photochemical processes. And then he has chosen for one particular lens, which is a 40mm lens. So really, he has chosen for this 4:3 aspect ratio to get that effect of having at the same time something very sharp in the middle of the image, in particular when it's a close-up, and that everything surrounding the close-up, let's say, is kept blurry, is kept out of focus. So he really plays with that, with the expectation of the viewer also. He keeps what is happening around the protagonist, around Saul, out of focus. Yes. But in a way, this also responds a lot to a lot of the questions that are being asked about what can be represented in terms of violence and suffering. So in a way, it's also a comfortable response in the way that he keeps what is happening around Saul unlegible, or unstable at least.
Mm-hmm. And regarding the soundtrack, as far as I know, we are very often not aware of the fact that there is actually music in the background. Film doesn't show it, but actually it speaks a bit to our subconscious. Am I right?
If there's music in the film, there's sound design, which involves lots of sound sources. I wouldn't know about particular sound music pieces that are being used. Sound pieces are being used indeed, but musical pieces, I don't know. No.
Thank you. I don't see other questions. There is a question about literature, specific scientific literature that we could recommend. Do you have something that you would like to mention specifically? Or I am aware that the topic is really broad. So maybe another solution is that we, as we did during our former discussion, add some literature in the comments, but maybe you would like to drop something which seems to you especially important. Christophe, would you take this question?
Yes, thank you. What I do think that gives you a very good view on the Sonderkommando's life is actually In the Heart of the Hell, written by Zalman Gradowski. It's his testimony that he wrote during his time, of course, in the Sonderkommando, the 12th Sonderkommando, and he also died. He was killed also on the 7th of October as a result of the revolt that was kept at the end of the Birkenau camp. What I also would propose to do is, if you want to look a little bit on the representational debates, what I do think of what is a very good book, actually too, you have Images in Spite of All by Didi Huberman. It's a very good book on the analysis of the 4 photos taken by the Sonderkommandos. It's an analysis not only of what you can see and how this image was manipulated, not always with bad intentions, but he actually makes this archaeological appraisal of these 4 photos, and often the 4th photo isn't used in educational representations. Even today, if you visit Auschwitz-Birkenau and you go to Crema 5, on the place next in front of Crema 5, where these photos were taken, you actually see only 3 photos. So the 4th photo will only show some tree elements. You can't see anything on this photo. Is often not used, but this photo shows, of course, the situation, the context of where these photos are taken in. So this analysis is really good, and if you want to have a more specific, a very good publication, it's what also Stoffel told about, Mémoire des Camps. It's actually this exhibition on the visual representation. It was an exhibition that was organized in Paris. And there is an exhibition catalog, and it's still available in second-hand bookshops if you look online, Mémoire des Camps. And it gives a very good visual overview of the sources available. And then, of course, you have a lot of publications on Auschwitz. My personal favorites is of course everything written by Primo Levi, who has described so many essential elements what Auschwitz was about.
I will take 2 more questions that I've seen, and one is, I guess, to Stoffel. Do you agree with Lanzmann's statement that The Son of Saul is a kind of anti-Schindler's List film?
Well, it's anti-Schindler's List. The argument that László Nemes would always say is that the film is not about survival, but it's about death, which is actually the same argument that Lanzmann has used to talk about his film in relation to Schindler's List. So in that way, you could say it's anti-Schindler's List, and that's how Lanzmann meant it. So not to focus on the survival as something comforting, as something consoling, but to really, it's really a film about the dead, about being dead. And in the film, Saul says it: "We're already dead." So.
Thank you. And last question, which is of more general matter. It is about the uniqueness of Holocaust, and if you would like to express your opinion on the fact that there are, if showing other forms of violence and calling them Holocaust, in your opinion, is downplaying the role of the anti-Semitism in it. Do we see nowadays a competition of victims? Is it threatening what we know about Holocaust and the role as it has in the European history?
Well, what my personal view is on the uniqueness of the Holocaust is mainly by stating that, of course, every genocide is unique. It's an unique moment in time with a very specific set of actors and factors that is leading up towards the crime of crimes. So I can understand from your position, certainly as a position if you're from the victim side, that this uniqueness has a very important element in looking, in interpreting this specific historical event. But I'm also convinced that you need to compare historical cases of collective violence to see which are the dynamics that lie underneath. And what you actually can see is that some elements are very difficult to compare. Some elements are very difficult to compare the Rwandan genocide in another time scale, in another situation, in another continent. So you have a lot of problems in comparing, but when you focus on the dynamics, you have a lot of comparable elements like dehumanization, like othering and belonging mechanisms. And then you go, of course, more in the direction of human sciences, how collective violence is getting shaped between these interplaying factors and actors. And I think this is actually well necessary. If I look to the major historians and the debates they resulted in, like you have the Browning-Goldhagen debate, where one says it's a specific form of elimination anti-Semitism leading up towards a unique genocide, what the Goldhagen thesis is about. And then Browning discusses, of course, on the normality, or what Hannah Arendt would state, the banality of the evildoer, not the banality of the evil, but the evildoer. These are very important discussions, and they really progressed our understanding of collective violence. And if we look now and you look to see how concentration camps are organized in specific countries, which we know from human rights reports, then you can see a lot of very similar mechanisms, like how people are used as a labor force in concentration camps and etc. But of course, you can't directly compare refugee camp situations with concentration camp situations. So there is always this boundary, this limit of comparison. But for me, comparison is not obscene. It's something we need to do also to really take down these lessons, what we can learn from these episodes of collective violence. But we also need to respect that people are in different positions looking at violence. If you look at from a point of view from the victim group, then of course this has a completely other meaning than when you look at from an academic, trying to see which are the dynamics of genocide. And you need to respect all these positions and you need to interact. And what I do think is important, of course, is that you don't fight each other on this, but that you actually can see how the same goals we have, preventing that is happening again, preventing that it's growing into another direction, etc. This is actually the common ground we all share. If you even are a family member of a former victim group, or if you're an academic going into depth into the dynamics. So this is what we actually should find us, and we should prevent to come into zero-sum situations where there is this categorization of worse and worser forms of collective violence. This is not really helping us. We need to understand the mechanisms, but we need to respect the emotions that are evidently connected with these specific cases.
Thank you very much. We will now wrap up the discussion. I would like to thank you, our guests, and thank you, our viewers, for your questions, for your reflections. In the commentaries, we received a comment that we cannot actually forge the future without knowing the past. I think it's a very good summary to this discussion. And I would like to finish it also with a quotation from Zelman Gradowski that was mentioned during your presentations, your speeches. May the world at least behold a drop, a fraction of this tragic world in which we lived. And the film that we've shown today, I think it's one of the drops, and the scientific research, other films, images, they present us more, but it's only one drop. Thank you very much. I wish you good night.